The world is about to witness an earthquake in the heart of Catholic power. For centuries, the Vatican has been ruled by the West. But now the unstoppable force of Asia is breaking through every barrier. As white smoke rises, history will be rewritten. A new pope from Asia is set to seize the throne, shattering tradition and sending shockwaves across the globe. This is not just a change of leadership. These meetings were not about politics, but about prayer, listening, and discernment. Each cardinal was given the chance to speak, to share the needs and hopes of the Church from their own part of the world. The wounds of the Church were named honestly: the pain of abuse, the divisions between rich and poor, the longing for unity, the challenge of evangelizing in a world that often seemed indifferent or even hostile to faith. Journalist S. wrote of a new Francis effect, as people who had long felt distant from the Church began to return, drawn by the authenticity and warmth of the new Pope. In the slums of Manila, in the refugee camps of Syria, in the bustling cities of Africa and Latin America, stories spread of a Pope who remembered the forgotten, who listened to the voiceless, who walked with the wounded. Those who encountered him, whether in the halls of the Vatican or the streets of Rome, sensed something different. They saw in him the face of Christ, the Good Shepherd, who lays down his life for the sheep. They heard in his words the echo of Jesus. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." In the months that followed, Francis II called a synod on mercy and reconciliation. He invited bishops, priests, religious and lay people from every continent to share their stories, their struggles, and their hopes. The synod was not a stage for debates, but a space for listening and healing. Out of this gathering, new initiatives were born: programs for the poor, support for families, outreach to those on the margins. Through it all, Francis II remained a shepherd at heart. He rose early each morning to pray in the chapel, often alone, except for the gentle flicker of candlelight. He wrote letters to prisoners, to children, to those who had lost faith. He visited hospitals and schools, always seeking to be close to the people. The Church, renewed in hope, began to find its footing once more. The wounds of the past did not disappear overnight, but they began to heal. The poor found a friend in the new Pope. The marginalized found a welcome. The world found a sign of hope. And so, as the bells of St. Peter's rang out each day, the faithful were reminded that the heart of the Church beats strongest when it beats with mercy, humility, and love. Under the gentle guidance of Francis II, the Church set out on a new journey, a journey of faith, of hope, of service to the world. Part 9. The Challenge of Unity. The election of a new Pope is always a moment of profound transition, but this time, as Francis Tangle stepped into the role, the Church found itself at a unique crossroads. The conclave that brought him to the papacy was itself a symbol of a changing world. For the first time, the majority of cardinal electors hailed from outside Europe, reflecting the global face of Catholicism today. The hopes and anxieties of more than 1 billion faithful were now focused on the new shepherd who would be called to lead, not only with authority, but with humility and a deep sense of unity. The Church, renewed in hope, still faced many challenges. Divisions remained between conservatives and progressives, between rich and poor, between North and South. The question before Francis II was not simply how to govern, but how to heal. The conclave had been marked by honest conversations about the wounds of the Church, the pain of abuse, scandals, the decline of faith in the West, the struggles of the poor and marginalized, and the longing for a more inclusive, compassionate community. Francis II knew that unity could not be imposed from above. It had to be built from below, one relationship at a time. He called the Church to dialogue, to listen, to seek understanding. He reminded the faithful that unity was not uniformity, but a harmony of differences. "We are many parts, but one body," he said, echoing the words of St. Paul. "Let us strive for unity, not by erasing our differences, but by embracing them in love." His first months as Pope were marked by concrete gestures of reconciliation. He invited bishops from regions in conflict to meet and pray together. He reached out to communities that had long felt excluded: women, migrants, the poor, and those wounded by the church's failures. He encouraged bishops and priests to be close to their people, to listen to their joys and sorrows, to accompany them on the journey of faith. He called lay people to take up the rightful place in the life of the church, to use their gifts for the building up of the body of Christ. Again and again, the cardinals returned to the example of Pope Francis, his humility, his mercy, his refusal to judge, his insistence that the church must be a field hospital for the wounded. As the sun set on the eve of the conclave, Tangle knelt alone in his small room. There was no luxury here, only a simple crucifix, a worn Bible, and a rosary given to him by his mother. He prayed not for victory, but for the grace to accept whatever God willed. The new pope also faced the immense responsibility of appointing new bishops and cardinals, shepherds who would share his vision of a humble, listening church. Every appointment was an opportunity to build bridges to foster a culture of encounter and to ensure that the church's leadership reflected its global diversity. Francis II's approach to unity was pastoral rather than political. He did not seek to silence debate or to enforce conformity. Instead, he encouraged honest conversation, rooted in prayer and mutual respect. He knew that the path would not be easy. There would be misunderstandings, disagreements, even failures. But he trusted in the power of grace, in the wisdom of the Spirit, in the promise of Christ. I am with you always, to the end of the age. The world watched as the new pope undertook his first journeys outside Rome, following the example of his predecessors like John Paul II and Francis. Before him, Francis II traveled to places of suffering and hope, meeting with those on the margins and shining a light on issues often ignored: migration, poverty, religious persecution, and the need for interfaith dialogue. His visits were not only symbolic, they were a living witness to the Church's mission to be close to all people, especially the most vulnerable. Through it all, Francis II remained a man of prayer, a man of hope, a man of mercy. He trusted that God, who had begun the good work, would bring it to completion. He reminded the Church that greatness was found not in power, but in service, not in being first, but in being last. He called all the faithful to follow Christ, to take up their cross, to love as he had loved. The story of the conclave of Tangle's election became a story told in hushed tones, a story of mystery and grace. It was a story not of human achievement, but of divine mercy, not of ambition, but of surrender. It was a story that reminded the world that the Church, for all her flaws, was still the body of Christ, still a sign of hope, still a beacon of love. And so, as the sun rose over Rome, the bells of St. Peter's rang out once more, calling the faithful to prayer, to service, to hope. The Church, led by a humble shepherd, set out on a new journey, a journey of faith, of hope, of love. Part 10. The Dawn of a New Day. As the seasons changed and the first year of Francis II's pontificate unfolded, the Church began to sense a gentle but unmistakable transformation. The wounds of the past did not simply vanish, nor did all the disagreements and struggles dissolve overnight. Yet under the shepherd's heart of Francis II, hope grew quietly, like green shoots breaking through winter soil. The new pope's days were filled with the humble rhythms of service. He continued to visit the sick, the poor, and the forgotten, not as a distant authority, but as a companion on the journey. He listened to the voices of women, young people, and those who had felt unwelcome, inviting them to share their dreams for the Church. He gathered bishops and lay leaders from every continent, not to dictate answers, but to pray, to listen, and to discern together the movement of the Spirit. Francis II's leadership was marked by a deep trust in God's providence and a constant return to the gospel. He reminded the Church that its mission was not to build monuments to itself, but to be a living sign of Christ's love in the world. He called all the faithful to rediscover the joy of the gospel, to trust in mercy, and to walk humbly with God and one another. In the villages of Asia, the barrios of Latin America, the cities of Africa, and the parishes of Europe and North America, stories began to ripple outward. People spoke of a church that listened, that forgave, that welcomed. The poor found a friend in the new pope. The marginalized found a home. The world found a sign of hope. The legacy of the conclave that elected Francis II became clear. The Church was not renewed by power or strategy, but by the humble courage to choose mercy over judgment, listening over speaking, and service over self-interest. The story of Tangle's journey to the papacy became a parable for the whole Church, a reminder that God often chooses the small, the gentle, and the humble to lead his people into new life. As the sun set over Rome, the bells of Saint, he thought of his childhood in Manila, of his mother's kitchen, where faith was lived in the sharing of bread and the washing of feet. He remembered the faces of those he had served, the hungry, the forgotten, the children with eyes bright with hope. In the silence, he felt the nearness of Christ, the Good Shepherd who calls each by name. Teehee world waited, not knowing what the dawn would bring. Peters rang out, calling the faithful to prayer. Francis II knelt in the quiet of his chapel, giving thanks for the gift of each day, for the grace to serve, and for the hope that never dies. He prayed for the Church, for the world, and for all who longed for peace. And so, a new day dawned for the Church. Not because every problem was solved, but because hearts had been opened anew to the power of love, the strength of humility, and the unending mercy of God. Dear friends, the story of Francis II and this new chapter in the life of the Church is not just history, it is an invitation to each of us to walk the path of humility, to listen with compassion and to serve with joy. The Church is renewed every time we choose love over fear, mercy over judgment, and hope over despair. If this story has touched your heart, if you believe in the possibility of a more merciful and humble Church, I invite you. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of faith and hope. Share your thoughts and prayers in the comments below. How do you dream of a Church that listens, welcomes, and heals? Your voice matters. Let us journey together as one family into the dawn of a new day. News cameras were set up in the square. Journalists speculated about Papal, the likely candidates. But inside the Vatican, the true work was happening in silence and prayer, in the humble hearts of those who knew that the Church did not need a ruler of power, but a shepherd of souls. A man who would serve, not dominate, who would listen, not command, who would heal, not condemn. The conclave would soon begin. The doors of the Sistine Chapel would close with the ancient cry, "Extra omnes," all outsiders out. Only the cardinals, guided by the Holy Spirit, would remain. The world would look to the chimney for the sign of white smoke, for the joyful cry, "Habemus Papam." But in these quiet hours, a new story was beginning, a story not of ambition, but of surrender, not of conquest, but of compassion. In the hush of sede, vacante, the Church stood at the threshold of mystery. The faithful prayed for a shepherd after God's own heart, one who would walk with them in humility and love, and in the quiet heart of the Vatican tangle, prayed for the grace to be small, to be faithful, to be ready for whatever God might ask. As night deepened over Rome, the bells of St. Peter's remained silent, but in the hearts of the faithful, hope was alive, a hope that the Spirit would guide the Church, as he always had, into the dawn of a new day. Part 2. The Gathering of the Shepherds. The morning of May 7th arrived with a gentle Roman light pouring over the ancient stones of St. Peter's Basilica. The world's eyes turned to the Vatican, where a sacred tradition was about to unfold, a tradition that for centuries had shaped not only the destiny of the Church, but also the hopes of millions searching for meaning, hope, and peace. As the bells tolled, cardinals from every continent, clad in scarlet, gathered in the grand nave of St. Peter's for the Elegendo Papa Mass. This was not merely a ceremony, it was an invocation of the Holy Spirit, a humble plea for guidance and wisdom. The faces in the congregation reflected the diversity of the modern Church: Africans, Asians, Latin Americans, Europeans, North Americans, all united in prayer, all aware of the immense responsibility before them. After the Mass, a solemn procession began. The cardinals, 135 in number, but only 1 in 20 eligible to vote, moved in silence toward the Sistine Chapel, their footsteps echoing through the marble corridors. Each carried with him not just the hopes of his own land, but also the wounds and dreams of the global Church. For the first time in history, the majority of the voting cardinals were from outside Europe, a sign of the Church's shifting center of gravity, a living testament to the seeds sown by missionaries and the faith blossoming in the global South. As the last cardinal entered, the doors of the Sistine Chapel were closed with the ancient proclamation, Extra omnes, all outsiders out. Only the cardinals, the master of papal liturgy, cal celebrations, and the preacher remained. This is the dawn of a new era, one that will redefine faith power and the destiny of over 1 billion souls. If you think the Vatican could never be the same again, you're absolutely right. What happens next will change everything. Subscribe now and tell us, will an Asian Pope change the world? Drop your thoughts below. Part 1. The Silence of Sede, Vacante. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica fell silent as dusk settled over Rome. The preacher delivered a meditation, reminding the electors of their sacred duty to seek not their own will, but the will of God, and to act for the good of the universal Church. He spoke of humility, of listening to the Spirit, of the need for a shepherd who would carry the wounds of the world with compassion and hope. The preacher's words lingered in the air, a gentle challenge to each heart. You are called to choose not a prince, but a servant. Remember the example of Jesus, who washed the feet of his disciples and laid down his life for his friends. Seek the one who will lead by love, not by fear. When the meditation ended, the preacher and the master of ceremonies departed, leaving the cardinals alone in the sacred silence of the Sistine Chapel. Each cardinal approached the altar, placed his hand on the gospel, and swore an oath of secrecy and fidelity. They pledged to uphold the rules of the conclave, to resist all outside influence, and to seek only the will of God for the Church. The voting began. Each cardinal received a ballot inscribed with the words, Eligo in summum pontificem, I elect as supreme pontiff. In silence, each wrote a name, folded the paper, and placed it in the chalice. The ballots were counted one by one, and then burned. Black smoke rose from the chimney, signaling to the world that the Church was still discerning, that no decision had yet been reached. Outside in St. Peter's Square, the faithful waited. Some prayed the rosary, others sang hymns. Many simply watched, the chimney hearts beating with hope and anxiety. The world's media speculated about possible successors, but inside the chapel, the true work was happening in silence and prayer, in the hearts of those seeking the Spirit's guidance. Among the cardinals, Tangle moved with quiet grace. He listened more than he spoke, offering a gentle word here, a prayerful presence there. He did not campaign, did not seek attention. He aired the words of Pope Francis. Humility is the foundation of Christian life. We are not called to greatness in the eyes of the world, but to smallness in the eyes of God. Tangle's heart was anchored in prayer, trusting that God would do what was needed. The first votes revealed no clear consensus. Names rose and fell, with each round reflecting the diversity of hopes and visions among the cardinals. Some looked to Europe for stability, others to Africa or Latin America for renewal. But increasingly, whispers turned to Asia, to the possibility of a pope from the East, a shepherd who could bridge worlds and embody the Church's global face. The presence of so many cardinals from the global South was itself a quiet revolution. In the past, conclaves had been dominated by Europeans, but now voices from Asia, Africa, and Latin America carried weight. The Church was no longer Eurocentric. It was truly universal. As the day wore on, the cardinals returned to their rooms, each carrying the WW8 of discernment. The process was not about politics, but about prayerful listening to God, to one another, to the cries of the world. They remembered the wounds of the Church scandals, divisions, the pain of those who felt excluded or forgotten. They remembered the hopes for a Church that welcomes all, that reaches out to the margins, that offers forgiveness instead of judgment. Tangle spent the evening in quiet prayer. He thought of his mother's kitchen in Manila, of the street children he had served, of the refugees he had comforted. He prayed not for victory, but for the grace to accept whatever God willed. He remembered the words of the prophet Micah. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? Outside the world waited for white smoke, for the joyful cry, Habemus Papam. But inside the conclave, the true work had only just begun. A work not of ambition, but of surrender, not of conquest, but of compassion. The cardinals trusted that the Spirit would guide them, that mercy would triumph over fear, that love would have the final word. In the sacred silence of the Sistine Chapel, a new chapter in the story of the Church was being written, a chapter shaped by humility, by listening, by the quiet courage to follow wherever the Spirit might lead. Part 2. The Gathering of the Shepherds. The morning of May 7th arrived with a gentle Roman light pouring over the ancient stones of St. Peter's Basilica. The city, usually alive with the sounds of tourists and pilgrims, seemed to pause in a moment of collective breath. The chair of Peter was empty. Pope Francis had returned to the Father, and now the whole world entered the sacred hush of sede vacante, the time when the papal throne stands vacant and the Church waits in prayer and expectation. In the shadow of the great dome, crowds gathered in St. Peter's Square. The world's eyes turned to the Vatican, where a sacred tradition was about to unfold, a tradition that for centuries had shaped not only the destiny of the Church, but also the hopes of millions searching for meaning, hope, and peace, as the bells tolled cardinals from every continent clad in scarlet gathered in the grand nave of St. Peter's for the Pro Elegendo Papal Mass. This was not merely a ceremony, it was an invocation of the Holy Spirit, a humble plea for guidance and wisdom. The faces in Tihi congregation reflected the diversity of the modern Church: Africans, Asians, Latin Americans, Europeans, North Americans, all united in prayer, all aware of the immense responsibility before them. After the Mass, a solemn procession began. The cardinals, 135 in number, but only 120 eligible to vote, moved in silence toward the Sistine Chapel, their footsteps echoing through the marble corridors. Each carried with him not just the hopes of his own land, but also the wounds and dreams of the global Church. For the first time in history, the majority of the voting cardinals were from outside Europe, a sign of the Church's shifting center of gravity, a living testament to to the seeds sown by missionaries and the faith blossoming in the global south. As the last cardinal entered, the doors of the Sistine Chapel were closed with the ancient proclamation, extra omnes, all outsiders out, only the cardinals, the master of papal liturgical celebrations, and the preacher remained. The preacher delivered a meditation reminding the electors of their sacred duty to seek not their own will, but the will of God, and to act for the good of the universal church. He spoke of humility, of listening to the spirit of the need for a shepherd who would carry the wounds of the world with compassion and hope. The preacher's words lingered in the air, a gentle challenge to each heart. You are called to choose not a prince, but a servant. Remember the example of Jesus, who washed the feet of his disciples and laid down his life for his friends. Seek the one who will lead by love, not by fear. When the meditation ended, the preacher and the master of ceremonies departed, leaving the cardinals alone in the sacred silence of the Sistine Chapel. Each cardinal approached the altar, placed his hand on the gospel, and swore an oath of secrecy and fidelity. They pledged to uphold the rules of the conclave, to resist all outside influence, and to seek only the will of God for the Church. The vote in G began. Each cardinal received a ballot inscribed with the words, Eligo in summum pontificem, I elect as supreme pontiff. In silence, each wrote a name, folded the paper, and placed it in the chalice. The ballots were counted one by one, and then burned. Black smoke rose from the chimney, signaling to the world that the church was still discerning, that no decision had yet been reached. Outside in St. Peter's Square, the faithful waited. Some prayed the rosary, others sang hymns. Many simply watched, the chimney hearts beating with hope and anxiety. The world's media speculated about possible successors, but inside the chapel, the true work was happening in silence, in prayer, in the hearts of those seeking the Spirit's guidance. Among the cardinals, Tango moved with quiet grace. He listened more than he spoke, offering a gentle word here, a prayerful presence there. He did not campaign, did not seek attention. He remembered the words of Pope Francis. Humility is the foundation of Christian life. We are not called to greatness in the eyes of the world, but to smallness in the eyes of God. Tango's heart was anchored in prayer, trusting that God would do what was needed. The first votes revealed no clear consensus. Names rose and fell with each round, reflecting the diversity of hopes and visions among the cardinals. Some looked to Europe for stability, others to Africa or Latin America for renewal, but increasingly whispers turned to Asia, to the possibility of a pope from the East, a shepherd who could bridge worlds and embody the Church's global face. The presence of so many cardinals from the global South was itself a quiet revolution. In the past, conclaves had been dominated by Europeans, but now voices from Asia, Africa, and Latin America carried weight. The Church was no longer Eurocentric. It was truly universal. Some held candles, others rosaries. Many simply stood in silence, their faces marked by both grief and hope. The faithful prayed for the soul of Francis, the gentle shepherd who had guided the Church with humility, mercy, and a tireless love for the poor. Their prayers rose like incense, mingling with the cool night air, carrying with them the longing for a new shepherd, one who would continue the work of healing, of listening, of walking with those on the margins. As the day wore on, the cardinals returned to their rooms, each carrying the weight of discernment. The process was not about politics, beauty about prayerful listening to God, to one another, to the cries of the world. They remembered the wounds of the Church, scandals, divisions, the pain of those who felt excluded or forgotten. They remembered the hopes for a Church that welcomes all, that reaches out to the margins, that offers forgiveness instead of judgment. Tango spent the evening in quiet prayer. He thought of his mother's kitchen in Manila, of the street children he had served, of the refugees he had comforted. He prayed not for victory, but for the grace to accept whatever God willed. He remembered the words of the prophet Micah. What does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? Outside the world waited for white smoke, for the joyful cry, Habemus Papam. But inside the conclave, the true work had only just begun, a work not of ambition, but of surrender, not of conquest, but of compassion. The cardinals trusted that the Spirit would guide them, that mercy would triumph over fear, that love would have the final word. In the sacred silence of the Sistine Chapel, a new chapter in the story of the Church was being written. A chapter shaped by humility, by listening, by the quiet courage to follow wherever the Spirit might lead. Part 3. The quiet work of discernment. Within the sacred walls of the Sistine Chapel, the conclave entered its most delicate and mysterious phase, the work of discernment. After the first solemn day, marked by only a single ballot, the cardinals settled into the daily rhythm of prayer, reflection, and voting. 4 ballots would be cast each day, 2 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, each a silent plea for guidance, each a humble act of surrender to the will of the Holy Spirit. The world outside watched the chimney, waiting for the signal. Black smoke for no decision, white smoke for a new pope. But within the chapel, time seemed to slow. The cardinals, 135 in number from 71 countries, were isolated from all outside influence, moving only between their simple rooms at Casa Santa Marta and the chapel itself. They had sworn an oath of absolute secrecy. No news, no messages, no distractions, only prayer, conversation, and the weight of the Church's future upon their hearts. The voting process was solemn and precise. Each cardinal received a ballot inscribed with the Latin phrase, Eligo in summum pontificem, I elect as supreme pontiff. In the privacy of his conscience, he wrote the name of the one he believed God was calling. The ballots were collected in a silver chalice, counted, and then burnt. If no one reached the required 2/3 majority, the smoke rose black above the Vatican, and the process began again. This was not a contest of politics or ambition. The cardinals spoke quietly among themselves, sharing stories of their dioceses, the wounds and hopes of the faithful, the challenges of evangelizing in a rapidly changing world. Many reflected on the legacy of Pope Francis, a church of mercy, humility, and outreach to the margins. With 108 of the 135 voting cardinals appointed by Francis, his vision of a pastoral, listening church was present in every conversation. Tangle moved among his brothers with a gentle presence. He listened more than he spoke, always attentive to the needs and anxieties of others. When tensions rose or doubts surfaced, he offered a quiet word of encouragement, reminding his fellow cardinals of the words of Jesus, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." He spoke of the Church as a field hospital, echoing Pope Francis, where wounds are tended and hope is restored. As the ballots accumulated, no clear favorite emerged. Names rose and fell with each round. Some cardinals, well known in the media, quickly lost momentum. Others, less familiar, began to draw attention for their humility, wisdom, or capacity to unite. The process was slow, sometimes frustrating, but always marked by a spirit of prayer and discernment. In the evenings after the ballots were burned and the black smoke had drifted into the Roman sky, the cardinals gathered for meals and quiet conversation. They spoke of the needs of the Church, the pain of abuse, scandals, the longing for unity, the challenge of secularism, the hope for a renewed missionary spirit. They shared memories of Pope Francis's teachings, his insistence on humility, his call to go to the peripheries, his vision of a church that listens before it speaks. Inside the Vatican walls, the College of Cardinals prepared for the most sacred and secretive of all church rituals. The conclave, the air was thick with anticipation, but also with the humility that comes from standing at the threshold of mystery. In the halls and chapels, cardinals from every corner of the world greeted one another with embraces and gentle words. Tangle's name began to appear more often on the ballots. Some saw in him the continuation of Francis's vision. A shepherd who would listen, heal, and accompany others saw a bridge between continents, a sign that the church truly belonged to all peoples. Yet Tangle himself remained rooted in prayer, never seeking the office, always trusting that God's will would be done. One evening, as the cardinals gathered for the liturgy of the hours, Tangle was invited to offer a reflection. He spoke softly. His words seemed play and full of conviction. The Good Shepherd leaves the 99 to seek the one who is lost. He does not count the cost. He simply goes because love compels him. The church does not need heroes. She needs servants, men and women who will walk with the wounded, who will lift up the broken, who will love without counting the cost. His words lingered in the air, a gentle challenge, a quiet invitation to deeper discernment. The cardinals returned to their rooms in silence, each one pondering the path ahead. In the stillness, the Spirit moved, weaving together the hopes and fears of the church into a tapestry of grace. Outside, the faithful waited for the signal of white smoke, for the joyful cry, Habemus Papam. But inside, the real work continued, a pilgrimage of hearts, a search for the shepherd who would lead the church with humility, mercy, and love. The conclave was not a contest, but a journey toward the heart of Christ, a journey marked by listening, surrender, and trust. And in that sacred space, hope was born, anew, a hope rooted not in human achievement, but in the boundless mercy of God. Part 4. The Mystery of Mercy. As the days of the conclave unfolded, a spirit of vulnerability and honesty began to permeate the Sistine Chapel. The cardinals, stripped of all titles and worldly distractions, found themselves face to face with the wounds and hopes of the church. They spoke openly about the crises that had shaken the faithful, scandals that had left scars, divisions that seemed impossible to heal, and the pain of those who had felt abandoned or misunderstood by the very shepherds meant to care for them. Yet even as these wounds were named, something else quietly emerged, a longing for mercy. It was not a vague sentiment, but a concrete desire for the church to become again what Pope Francis had so often called a field hospital, a place where the hurting could find healing, where the lost could find a home, where every person, no matter their story, could encounter the embrace of Christ. Tangle's life had always been marked by mercy. He had learned it as a child in Manila, watching his mother share bread with neighbors who had nothing. He had seen it in the tired eyes of street children, in the gentle hands of nurses tending the sick, in the quiet prayers of the elderly who clung to hope in the darkness. Mercy for Tangle was not an abstract idea. It was the beating heart of the gospel, the very face of Jesus. Within the conclave, Tangle's witness became a gentle light. He listened to the pain of his brothers, never judging, always encouraging. When a cardinal from a country torn by war spoke of his people's suffering, Tangle simply placed a hand on his shoulder and prayed with him. When another cardinal wept for the victims of abuse in his diocese, Tangle wept with him, reminding him that Christ too had wept at the tomb of his friend. In these moments, the cardinals rediscovered the power of mercy, not as weakness, but as the deepest strength of the church. The ballots continued, and with each round, the desire for a shepherd of mercy grew stronger. The cardinals remembered the words of Pope Francis. The Eucharist is not a prize for the perfect, but a powerful medicine for the weak. They spoke of the need for a church that welcomes all, that refuses to close its doors to anyone seeking hope, forgiveness, or a new beginning. During one of the evening prayers, Tangle was asked to share a meditation. He spoke softly, his words carrying the weight of lived experience. Mercy is the language of God. It is the first word and the last. When we open our hearts to mercy, we become like Christ. Not because we are strong, but because we know what it is to be weak and forgiven. The world does not need a church of perfect people. It needs a church of forgiven people who forgive in turn. Let us be that church. His words resonated deeply. Many had traveled great distances, from the barrios of Manila, the villages of Africa, the bustling cities of Latin America, and the ancient cathedrals of Europe. They carried with them the hopes and wounds of their people, and the memory of Francis's call to be a church that goes forth, that listens, that serves. Among the cardinals, whispers of names passed quietly, but one name lingered in the hearts of many Tangle. The cardinals, many of whom had carried the burdens of leadership for years, felt a new freedom, a freedom to admit their own need for mercy, a freedom to hope that the church could be renewed, not by strength, but by compassion. As the ballots were counted, Tangle's name continued to rise. Some cardinals saw in him the living echo of Francis's vision, a church that heals, that listens, that embraces. Others saw a sign of hope for the global church, a leader from Asia whose life was a bridge between continents, cultures, and wounds. Yet Tangle himself remained rooted in humility. Each night he prayed for the grace to accept whatever God willed. He asked for the strength to forgive, to listen, to serve. He remembered the words of the prophet Micah, which had guided him since his youth. What does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? Outside the world waited for news. Inside the cardinals waited for the Spirit. In the silence, mercy was at work, healing old wounds, opening new possibilities, preparing the church age for a future shaped, not by fear but by love. The mystery of mercy, hidden yet powerful, was weaving its way through every heart in the conclave. It was a mystery that would not only shape the choice of the next pope, but would also mark the beginning of a new chapter for the church. A chapter where the first word and the last would always be mercy. Part 5. The Path of Humility. The days of discernment in the Sistine Chapel pressed deeper into the hearts of the cardinals. With each passing ballot, the air grew heavier, not with ambition, but with the realization that the church stood at a crossroads. The world outside speculated about power politics and alliances, but within these sacred walls, a different logic prevailed. The logic of the gospel, the logic of humility, was quietly transforming the conclave. Tangle's presence among the cardinals was a living reminder of this path. He never spoke of his own achievements. When others praised his work among the poor or his ability to unite communities divided by conflict, he gently shifted the conversation to the grace of God or to the courage and faith of those he had served. He listened with a patience that drew out the deepest hopes and fears of his brothers. He washed the feet of his fellow cardinals in secret, prayed for those who struggled with doubt, and sought always to build bridges where others saw only walls. The cardinals reflected often on the teachings of Pope Francis, whose papacy had been a constant call to humility. Francis had reminded the Church that God is attracted by our smallness when we accept it. He had shown the world that true greatness in the kingdom of God was found not in power or prestige, but in littleness, in service, in the willingness to become last so that others might be first. The cardinals remembered how Francis had knelt to wash the feet of prisoners, how he had embraced the sick and the forgotten, how he had wept with victims of tragedy and injustice. As the ballots continue, humility became the measure by which the cardinals weighed their choice. They asked not, "Who can lead us with strength?" but "Who can lead us with faithfulness?" They sought a shepherd who would be close to the people, who would listen before speaking, who would serve before leading. They remembered the words of Jesus: "Whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all." Tangle's humility shone brightest in moments of uncertainty. When his name appeared more frequently on the ballots, he did not change. He did not seek to persuade or to gather support. Instead, he prayed more fervently, asking God to guide the church and to grant him the grace to accept whatever was asked of him. He confided in a close friend among the cardinals: "If the Lord calls, I will say yes, but I would rather be a servant in the house of God than a master in any palace." The cardinals saw in Tangle a man after God's own heart, a man who would lead not by force, but by love, not by ambition, but by humility. His witness inspired others to lay aside their own fears and ambitions, to trust that the Spirit was at work even in their weakness and uncertainty. He was not a name of renown for worldly triumphs, nor a figure of political ambition. Rather, Tangle was known for his tears with the poor, his long hours spent listening to the brokenhearted, and his gentle insistence on mercy. In the barrios of Manila, he was remembered as the priest who shared bread with street children and washed the feet of the elderly. One evening, as the sun set behind the dome of St. Peter's, the cardinals gathered for silent prayer. The chapel was bathed in golden light, and the faces of the saints in Michelangelo's frescoes seemed to watch with serene encouragement. Tangle knelt in the back, his head bowed, his heart open. He prayed for the church, for the poor, for those who had no voice. He prayed for his brothers in the conclave, that they might be guided by the Spirit and not by fear. He prayed for the grace to serve, to love, to forgive. The night deepened, and the cardinals lingered in silence. Some wept quietly, overwhelmed by the weight of their task. Others found comfort in the prayers of their brothers, in the knowledge that they were not alone. In that sacred space, the Spirit moved, softly gently, persistently, preparing the way for what was to come. As the cardinals returned to their rooms, the sense of unity grew. The divisions that had once seemed insurmountable began to fade, replaced by a shared desire to follow the path of humility, to choose a shepherd who would walk with the wounded, who would lift up the broken, who would love without counting the cost. Outside Rome slept under a blanket of stars. Inside the church was being quietly renewed, not by grand gestures or dramatic speeches, but by the humble surrender of hearts open to God. The path of humility, once seen as weakness, was revealed as the true strength of the church, the secret of her endurance through centuries of trial and change. In the stillness of the night, Tangle prayed for the courage to be small, to be faithful, to be ready for whatever God might ask. He knew that leadership in the church was a burden, not a privilege, a call to serve, not to rule. He remembered the words of Mary, the humble serva, and T of the Lord. "Behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord. Let it be done to me according to your word." The dawn would bring new ballots, new questions, new challenges. But for now, the church rested in the quiet assurance that the Spirit was near, guiding her along the path of humility, preparing her for the dawn of a new day. Part 6. The Night of Discernment. As the days of the conclave drew on, the sense of anticipation within the Sistine Chapel deepened. The ballots had begun to reveal a gentle but unmistakable consensus. Tangle's name, once a quiet presence among many, now appeared with growing frequency. Yet even as the possibility of his election became real, the atmosphere among the cardinals was not one of competition, but of profound reverence and vulnerability. The church was not choosing a ruler, but searching for a servant willing to bear the weight of Peter's mantle, On the eve of what many sensed would be the decisive vote, the cardinals gathered for prayer in the softly lit chapel. The evening sun cast long shadows across the marble floor, and the faces of the saints in Michelangelo's frescoes seemed to glow with a quiet encouragement. The air was thick with expectation, but also with a deep sense of peace, a peace that comes only when hearts are surrendered to God's will. Tangle knelt in the back row, his head bowed low. He prayed for the church, for the poor, for the broken and the lost. He prayed for his brothers in the conclave, that they might be guided, not by fear or ambition, but by the gentle wisdom of the Spirit. He prayed for the grace to accept whatever God would ask of him, whether it be to lead or to remain in humble service. In his prayer, he remembered the words of Jesus in the garden, "Not my will, but yours be done." As the cardinals finished the liturgy of the hours, Cardinal Tangle was invited to share a final reflection before the night's silence. He spoke softly, his words carrying the weight of lived experience and the tenderness of a shepherd's heart. Brothers, tonight we stand on holy ground. We are called not to greatness as the world sees it, but to the greatness of love. The world waits for a sign of hope, for a church that listens, that heals, that forgives. Let us be that church. Let us choose not with our minds alone, but with hearts open to the Spirit. Let us remember the poor, the forgotten, the wounded. Let us be small so that Christ may be great among us. His words lingered in the silence that followed. Some cardinals wept quietly, moved by the humility and sincerity in Tangle's voice. Others sat in deep contemplation, their hearts wrestling with the magnitude of what lay ahead. The conclave was not merely an election. It was a sacred act of surrender, a collective trust in the mysterious ways of God. After the prayer, the cardinals dispersed to their rooms. In the refugee camps of the Middle East, he was the cardinal who sat on the ground with those who had lost everything, offering only his presence and a quiet prayer. In Africa and Latin America, he was spoken of with affection as one who walked with us, not above us. Tangle's life had been shaped by the words of Jesus. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. He had never sought the spotlight. The corridors of Casa Santa Marta were hushed, each man alone with his thoughts and prayers. Some wrote letters home, others read scripture. Many simply sat in silence, letting the events of the day settle in their hearts. The night was long, filled with dreams, with memories, with whispered prayers for guidance. Tangle, too, returned to his simple room. He opened his Bible to the Beatitudes and read them slowly, letting each word sink deep into his soul. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. He thought of his mother's kitchen in Manila, of the street children who had taught him the meaning of joy, of the refugees, whose faith had sustained him in times of doubt. He felt the nearness of Christ, the Good Shepherd, who calls each by name and leads his flock with gentleness and strength. He prayed for the courage to say yes if called, and for the humility to step aside if not. He asked for the grace to be a bridge between peoples, to be a sign of hope for a wounded world, to be a servant of mercy and peace. As he closed his eyes, he entrusted himself and Tehe Church to the loving care of the Father, confident that whatever happened, the Spirit would guide them. Outside Rome was quiet, the city lights shimmering on the Tiber. In St. Peter's Square, a few faithful lingered in prayer candles, flickering in the night. The world waited, not knowing what the dawn would bring. But within the walls of the Vatican, a new chapter was being written. A chapter shaped not by power, but by humility, not by ambition, but by surrender, not by fear, but by love. The night of discernment was a night of hope, a night of trust, a night of letting go. And as the cardinal slept, the Spirit moved among them, preparing their hearts for the dawn of a new day. Part 7. The White Smoke. Dawn broke over Rome with a quiet expectancy. The city's ancient stones glowed in the early light, and St. Peter's Square filled with pilgrims, journalists, and the faithful all gazing up at the chimney atop the Sistine Chapel. Inside, the cardinals, gathered for what many sensed would be the decisive ballots. The air was thick with anticipation, but also with the peace that comes from surrendering to the Spirit's mysterious guidance. The morning began, as always, with prayer, the liturgy of the hours, and the celebration of the Eucharist. The cardinals, robed in scarlet, moved in silent procession, each carrying the hopes and burdens of their people. The Sistine Chapel, with its frescoes of creation and judgment, seemed to hold its breath. Tea ballots were distributed. Each cardinal, in the privacy of his conscience, wrote a name. The votes were cast, collected, and counted. The hush in the chapel deepened as the scrutineers unfolded each slip of paper. The numbers were tallied, and for a moment, time itself seemed to pause. A clear consensus had emerged. The name on the majority of ballots was Tangle. The Spirit had spoken through the humble discernment of the cardinals. The dean of the College of Cardinals approached Tangle, his voice trembling with emotion. "Do you accept your election as Supreme Pontiff?" Tangle, tears in his eyes, whispered, "With the help of God, I accept." The cardinals bowed their heads in prayer, offering thanks for the guidance of the Holy Spirit and for the courage of their new shepherd. The ballots were burned, and a special chemical was added to ensure the smoke would be unmistakably white. Outside, the world watched as the plume rose above the Vatican. A collective gasp swept through the crowd, followed by shouts of joy and tears of relief. Bells pealed across the city, echoing the ancient proclamation, "Habemus Papam," we have a pope. Inside, Tangle was led to the room of tears, where he donned the simple white cassock and red slippers prepared for the new pontiff. In that quiet space, he wept, not for himself, but for the Church, for the poor, for the immense responsibility now resting on his shoulders. He prayed for the grace to serve with humility, to listen with compassion, to lead with love. He chose the name Francis II in honor of the Pope who had taught him the meaning of mercy, humility, and accompaniment. The choice was a sign, both to the cardinals and to the world, that the path of the gospel would continue, a path of listening, of healing, of walking with those on the margins. The great doors of St. Peter's Basilica opened, and the new pope stepped onto the balcony. The square erupted in applause, waves of emotion sweeping over the crowd. Tangle stood quietly, his hands folded, his face radiant with the peace that comes from surrendering to God's will. His ministry was marked by a quiet faithfulness, a willingness to be small in the eyes of the world, so as to be great in the eyes of God. He often quoted Pope Francis, reminding others that humility is the foundation of Christian life. We are not called to greatness in the eyes of the world, but to smallness in the eyes of God. Tangle's humility was not a strategy, but a way of life. In the days before the conclave, the cardinals gathered in general congregations. He raised his hand in blessing, and his first words were gentle but strong. Brothers and sisters, let us begin with prayer, for the Church, for the world, for the poor, for peace. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you and give you peace. In that moment, hope was reborn. The Church, wounded but alive, had found a new shepherd, not a ruler of power, but a servant of mercy. The world watched, some with skepticism, many with hope. But those who saw the tears on the new pope's face, who heard the humility in his voice, sensed that a new chapter was beginning. The bells of Rome rang out, calling the faithful to prayer, to service, to hope. The white smoke had signaled not just the election of a new pope, but the dawn of a new era, a time for mercy, for humility, for walking together as one people of God. And so began the pontificate of Francis II, once known as Tangle, the shepherd called from the margins to the heart of the church, entrusted with the task of leading God's people with love. Part 8, the shepherd's heart. From the very first hours of his pontificate, Pope Francis II, once simply known as Tangle, set a tone that was both gentle and revolutionary. The world's attention lingered on his first gestures, the way he bowed his head and asked the crowd in St. Peter's Square to pray for him before he blessed them, the way he spoke not as a monarch but as a brother, the way he smiled with tears in his eyes at the children pressed against the barricades. These were not calculated moves, but the natural outpouring of a heart formed by years of walking with the poor, the forgotten, and the wounded. The days that followed were marked by a spirit of renewal. Francis II's first public act was not a grand address or a diplomatic meeting, but a quiet visit to a hospice on the outskirts of Rome. There he sat with the dying, held the hands of those who had no family, and listened to their stories. He spoke little, but his presence was a balm. "You are not alone," he whispered to a frail woman. "The church is with you. Christ is with you." He visited a refugee center where he embraced families who had fled war and poverty. He knelt to wash the feet of a young mother and her child, echoing the humble gestures of his predecessor, but with a tenderness that was unmistakably his own. He told the gathered crowd, "We are all pilgrims. We are all searching for home. Let us walk together with compassion and hope." In his first homily, as Pope Francis II spoke from the heart, "The church is not a fortress, but a field hospital. We do not close our doors to anyone who seeks mercy. We do not ask for credentials before we offer bread to the hungry or shelter to the stranger. We are called to be the hands and heart of Christ in a world that is often cold and indifferent. Let us go forth, not with fear, but with the joy of the gospel." His words were simple, but they resonated deeply. Bishops and priests around the world listened and found themselves challenged to renew their own ministries. Lay people felt seen and valued. The poor, the sick, and the marginalized sensed that the church was once again their home. Francis II made it clear that he would not live in splendor. He chose a modest apartment in the Vatican guest house, ate his meals with the staff, and insisted on driving in a simple car. He often slipped out in the evenings accompanied by a single aide to visit shelters, soup kitchens, and families in need. He listened more than he spoke, always attentive to the stories and sorrows of those he met. He called the church to a deeper life of prayer and service. He encouraged parishes to open their doors to the homeless, to create spaces of welcome for migrants, to accompany those struggling with addiction or loneliness. He reminded the faithful that the Eucharist is not a prize for the perfect, but food for the journey of the weak. He urged all to rediscover the joy of the gospel, to let go of fear, and to trust in the boundless mercy of God. But above all, Francis II modeled humility. He did not seek applause or recognition. When praised, he pointed to Christ. When criticized, he listened and reflected. When faced with difficult decisions, he gathered his advisors, prayed, and sought consensus. He knew that the true power of the papacy was not in commanding, but in serving. The world watched, sometimes with skepticism, sometimes with awe.